Hello everybody and welcome back to Allan Wall's Photography. This is Allan and I want to welcome you to the third and final chapter of my best practices for macro photography lighting. And this also happens to be the long-awaited conclusion of the Lighting for Photography series. It's video number 13 if you can believe it. Thanks as always to everybody who supports my channel through Patreon or through the website. Couldn't do this without your help, and I really appreciate it. Now, where was I? So you've got your IKEAs all ready to go, and you bought a couple of Godox flashes, and you built a macro cage, and some exotic insect crawls into your house, gets up on the kitchen counter, and dies. What do you do now? Just like when you're going out to shoot, you have a plan. You have an insect. Now, the worst way you can approach this is to stick it on a pin, pop it in the cage, move the lights all around and take a bunch of pictures. That's not going to help you learn, and it's not going to result in any good pictures unless it's by accident. So the first thing you need to do is look at the insect. Use a magnifying glass or a microscope if you've got one. Does it have a shiny, chitinous body? Does it have reflective limbs? Does it have big eyes or interesting mouth parts or a stinger? Look at all of those elements and decide, what do you want to show in your photograph? Because that's going to impact what light you choose. Now, a general rule of thumb for me is, obviously, if your insect is still alive, I shoot live jumping spiders all the time, and that's a no-brainer. You really have to use flash. You just aren't going to get enough continuous lighting to freeze their motion because they're always twitching around. But let's say that your specimen is dead. So let me give you a couple of examples. You have a skinny insect that is mostly limbs and antennas and maybe a couple of wings, but the body's tubular. That might be the perfect insect to shoot with continuous light with LEDs, because you'll be able to position them wherever you want. There's nothing really that's going to act as a mirror for your LEDs, especially if you're using the multiple lens one. And because the thing is skinny and light, you're going to get a lot of transmission of light. So you're not going to need a huge difference in light from one side and light from the other. Their LEDs will be good because you can set a nice long shutter speed and illuminate the whole thing beautifully. But what if you have a beetle that's shiny on the back, say green and blue on the back, but the underside has a deeper bluish purple color to it, as there's a green beetle around here that's just like this. And you absolutely want to show that purplish color on the dark side of the bottom of the beetle. Now, LEDs probably wouldn't be a good choice here. First of all, you're going to reflect the individual lenses off the thing's back because it's so shiny. You'll also reflect the same little spots off its legs. But there's a bigger problem, and that is using LEDs. You're going to have a pretty significant shutter speed by significantly slow shutter speed, in order to get enough light underneath the beetle to bring out those beautiful colors. The problem then is that with lights that don't dim, by the time you've exposed the underside of the beetle, you've way overexposed the top part of the beetle, especially if you're in surroundings that aren't perfectly dark. That's why with continuous lighting, you really have to go to great lengths to make sure there is no light in your studio at all, which is a pain. Another reason I like flash. So let's say the insect that crawled into your kitchen was a bumblebee. Now, you know they're covered in bristles. They look really hairy. And a great way to show that insect would be to shine some light from behind to really make the edges of the hair glow, while also having enough light to pick up the face. Now, a bumblebee has a completely black face. And the eyes are somewhat reflective, but not super reflective. And there's nothing much of interest down below. That could be lit fairly decently with continuous light. But I would want a pop of bright light from behind the subject, usually using a bunch of flags to just result in a little sliver of light cutting across the top of the bee to act just like a hairlight in a human to create that lovely aura, that glow. You really couldn't do that with LEDs, again, for the same reason that you would never get the exposure right if you were trying to balance lights for different parts of the insect. And remember, the insect is black, which means it's going to absorb a lot of your light and require you have an even longer shutter speed. And I could go on and on and on with every insect that I've ever photographed, and the approach would be different with every one. So how do you pick an approach? That is going to impact the method you use as well. I highly recommend that you get hold of a couple of field guides. I have every one that's ever been published just because I like reading them, but get a couple so that, well, of course, if you're a modern person, you've probably got the internet too. You can use that. But when you find an insect, I highly recommend you go online or go to one of your books and see how other people have photographed it. And you'll find hundreds of examples online, and pick one that just works for you and try to emulate that yourself. You won't come up with the same result, and it's not copying. It's how you learn. But when you see something that you love in an insect presentation, try to figure out why. And in doing so, you'll realize which light would work and which light wouldn't. That's a great way to learn what the ideal light is. Now, that technique of looking at other people's work and trying to emulate it is all good and well if you already know how to use continuous light, you already know how to use flash. But if you don't, you'll probably be fairly mystified to look at a beautiful photograph of an insect and try to figure out how it was done. How much of it was actual lighting? How much of it was done in Photoshop? Was this a stacked image or a single shot? All that type of stuff. If you don't have any experience, you're not going to be able to figure that out. So I'm going to digress for just a second and give you an exercise which to this day I still do. And that is take an everyday object, something lying around the house. My favorite thing to use is a little ball. I'll dip each side of it in a different color of acrylic paint and just let it dry. I think these are called foosballs, and I have no idea what a foos is or what kind of game you play with it, but they're small and hard and they have a hairy surface on them, so they hold the paint really well. But yeah, anyway, that's neither here nor there. I drill a hole right through the ball and then put a piece of wire through it and dip it, then roll it over and dip it in another color once the other part's dry. And you end up with a beautiful round surface with two different colors. And because you've already got a hole, you can put it on a toothpick or something and mount it in your macro cage. And that's what I use to experiment with new lighting. When I have new lights or a new idea, or I'm thinking about how to get a particular effect, but I don't want to be distracted by the insect. It's very easy if you're trying to teach yourself a new technique to get so caught up in what you're photographing that you're not seeing what's happening with the light. But if you have this brightly colored ball that you can position and then use your light to light certain areas of that ball and just those areas, in no time flat, you'll start to understand where the light needs to be placed, how close, how far, how bright, what are the angles you want to work with. It's the easiest way to learn. Once you've done that, you will start to realize that you have a library of effects that you're building up, a library of lighting angles and intensities that you can use. Then you'll have an intuitive understanding of what subject is going to work with what light, and you'll know where to put them. Now, as far as the practical side of taking the photographs, I recommend that once you have determined your plan of how you want to light this particular insect, you do it in a very methodical way. By that I mean one light at a time, as I've told you before. Start always with the key light, and don't quit working with the key light until you are absolutely happy with the look from the key light. Is it illuminating the parts you want to the brightness that you want? Then work on a little bit of fill light if you're going to use it to brighten up the shadows on the other side. Then if you want a rim light from behind, or you want an accent light from somewhere else, then add that. And at the very end, when you're perfectly happy with the lighting for your subject, throw some light on the background if you're going to use a lit background. So if you do it methodically and you do it that way every time, you won't miss things. And that leads me to my next best practice. Have a checklist. Now, this might sound ridiculous, like it did when I told you the same thing outdoors, but have a checklist. When you are finished setting up your shot, walk away from it for a few minutes and then come back and look at your subject and ask yourself the following questions. Are the points of interest well illuminated? It's fairly simple. Can I see the eyes? Can I see the individual oculi of the compound lens? If it's mouth parts, are the mouth parts bright enough? Is it picking out all of the detail? The second thing is, ask yourself, is there any light on this subject that is distracting me, that's drawing my eye away from what I want you to see? This is so easy to overlook if you don't have a systematic approach to doing it. Then take another look at the overall subject and make sure there aren't any hot spots or blobs of reflected light. It's similar to the ones that would distract you, but they're lights that are actually in the part that you want illuminated. But are any of the highlights so specular that they're losing detail? Then look at the shadows, the parts that you have deliberately not directly illuminated, and see if they are too dark to see detail. If you want detail, which you do, you don't ever want to sacrifice detail in the shadows, make sure that you have enough light to see. It's off-putting when it's completely black with no detail in it. Lastly, before you take the photograph, look at the composition. Look at the overall photograph and decide, is this a pleasing composition? Do I like this overall look? Because it's amazing. I have done this. I do it every time I take a photograph, but I've done it in the past where I've gone to great lengths to set up every light just the way I want it, and I'm really happy with the lighting. And then I pause before I take the photograph and I look at it, and the composition just doesn't work. There's something about it. Now, a lot of this you can change if it's just a matter of changing the frame. You can move your specimen up or across a little bit. You can frame it better. Maybe it's something to do with the backlight. Maybe you need a gradient in the backlight. There's a lot of things that you can try, but if you don't look critically at the image before you take it, nothing magic is going to happen between that point and when you've got the photograph. And if you're not going to like it, figure out why and fix it before you take the picture. One other thing about setting up the image, be very careful not to nudge or move your insect, because the position of your insect, the pose of your insect, is everything in the lighting. If your insect is at this angle, and then at the last minute you decide, no, I think it would be better a little bit more straight on, your lighting doesn't work anymore. If you've done it right, the lighting was specific for the insect in that position. So try not to change your subject or move your subject, which means spend time at the beginning posing it the way you want it. We're not shooting film, so shoot lots of test shots, even if you're using continuous light. It's easier to look at a photograph, especially if you're working tethered, which I recommend. It's much easier to look at a photograph than it is to look at the back of your camera, where everything is a little bit small and the quality's not great. You can't really see the subtleties. One thing I didn't mention when we were talking about setting up your workspace, but I'm going to mention it now. Include in your workspace an easily accessible, bright work light. By that, my macro cage has a powerful fluorescent strip light. They're permanently fixed to the cage, and attached to the upright of the cage is a switch. When I'm working on an image, at any point I can click that switch and the whole area is lit up. That's really important if you're using flash and you're working in a dark environment. It'll help you focus. It'll help you do a lot of different things. And of course, if you're using continuous light, you'd want to turn that off before you start positioning your lights. I know this is not strictly a lighting thing, but if you use lighted backgrounds and you're using a physical background, not a computer screen, which I recommend that you use a physical background that is separately lit with a different light that you can set the intensity of. You can even set up a gradient using a single light source. But if you're doing that, get a good collection of backdrop cards. I have cards in every imaginable color, from earth tones to pastels to bright primary colors. And when I'm looking at an insect to photograph, I will try to choose a color that harmonizes well, maybe a complementary color that allows the insect to really shine. The second thing, which is important if you're using flash, but absolutely critical if you're using continuous light. Once everything is set up, turn out all of your photographic lights, all of the lights lighting your subject and your background, and take a photograph at the shutter speed you're going to use for your stack or for your individual shot. You need to make sure that there is no ambient light spoiling your background, or worse yet, impinging on your subject. And the only way you can do that is to take a test shot at the correct shutter speed. With flash, I almost always shoot at my sync speed, which is 1/250th of a second, and even a fair amount of stray light isn't going to show up at that speed. So with flash, it's less of a problem. But if you're using 1/5 of a second shutter speeds with LEDs, and you have a little chink of light coming under the door, that can be enough to ruin your photograph. So double check before you start. Is all the light eliminated? When I'm using continuous light and long exposures, I actually put towels along the cracks in the floor, anywhere that light's getting in. Or wait till nighttime is the other way to do it. And then you take your photograph or your photographs. But the job isn't really over yet. Some of the more intellectually demanding work is just starting. You need to look at your images very, very critically. It's hard to do because if you've spent 2 hours taking a single photograph, you are going to be so invested in that photograph that you're probably not going to see it as objectively as you should. But I strongly recommend, if that is the case, that you are having trouble seeing the strengths or weaknesses of it, have a macro friend look at it. I am amazed by how often I'll review a photograph for somebody, and I tend to give a very detailed and specific review of what I see and what I might have done differently. The number of times the response I get is, that was so obvious and I couldn't see it. And that's why getting somebody else to look at it. If you're a member of our Discord group, if you're not, I don't know why, but if you are, there's a place over there that you can actually share your images. Now, you're not going to get necessarily really in-depth reviews. If you want something like that, contact me or somebody else who can do it for you and make those arrangements. But every once in a while, having a second pair of eyes look at your image is great. If you have just spent 2 hours photographing something and you've been using techniques that are new to you, and you got a result that you love, how are you ever going to remember where everything was? Grab your phone and take a couple of pictures of your setup from whatever angles you need to be able to see all of the components and where they're set up. I would also recommend, just like I did when we were outdoors, is you keep a notebook. I have a stack of notebooks now from years gone by, but I'll just make a note of the date and I'll attach a picture if I took one, and I'll make a few notes about maybe light intensity, flash settings, camera settings, whatever. It sounds like a lot of work, but let me tell you, the way that the human brain works, if you hear something or you see something, even if you describe something to somebody else, you use a different part of your brain than if you write it down. Writing something down is a much more complex process. It goes through different parts of your brain, and it is much, much more effective for remembering stuff. If you've never experienced this phenomenon, I strongly recommend you give it a try. You don't have to write a book. Just writing down a few notes will cement that thought process in your mind like nothing else will. So, of course, if you're going to go to the trouble to spend time critically reviewing your work and taking some notes, maybe showing the picture to somebody else, that's not going to do you much good unless you have a plan for using it. And I strongly recommend, if you have worked a long time on a photograph and you're disappointed in the results, don't break your setup down. Give it a while. Give it a day or so, which is another reason to have a dedicated space if you possibly can. But after you've shown your photograph to somebody and they've said A, B, and C about it, and you've internalized all that, go back and shoot it again. You will be amazed how a tiny difference in the position of a light or a flash setting or the kind of diffuser you use can salvage a photograph out of nowhere. I'll be the first to acknowledge it is really difficult for me to take a terrible photograph and send it to somebody so that they can give me feedback on what's wrong, because sometimes I can't see it. I just know I hate the photograph. It's hard to do. It hurts the ego. But if we do that, and then if we follow up by taking the picture over again until we get it right, you will learn so fast it'll make your head spin. But the worst thing we can do is just look at a photograph and say, oh, that's rubbish, and throw it away. So you've not only wasted the photograph, but you've wasted the 2 hours it took to take it, because you'll never remember what you did and you'll just do it again. In an attempt to make this a little bit more practical, I'm going to just take a few minutes and we'll go over to the macro cage, and I'm going to shoot a very basic object, and I'm going to show you the steps I go through to set up my lighting. I'm not going to take a whole lot of time doing this because it would be an entirely separate video all on its own, but I'll show you the basic steps. And if there's an interest, we can pick some difficult specimens and work through them that way in the future. But for now, let me just show you the steps that I take. All right, welcome back to the cage. Here we are. Now, this is an incredibly simple setup. I'm going to be just taking a single shot. Our model for this evening is a small lady with a big head and a pistol. I found her at the thrift shop. She was accompanied by a man that it looked like she was getting ready to put to death. The toys aren't what they used to be, you know? Anyhow, so what I'm going to show you now is how I would go through the setup process for this very simple photograph. I have no light in here. It's completely dark. And when I turn out the lights, you'll see how dark it is. I've covered everything. Even though I'm using flash, I probably didn't need to. Here's the challenge that I set myself. I looked at her and she's not very attractive, but she appears sad. Her eyes are closed and she's got a frowny face on and she's carrying a gun. What I've decided I need to do is photograph her in a way that complements how sad she looks. Now, you're probably thinking, what use is this? I mean, I'm trying to learn about macro photography. Well, believe me, it's exactly the same process. There are some creatures that you'll look at that just look sinister, and you want to bring that out with lots of dark backgrounds and what have you. But this is, this is a bit more interesting than your average insect, because I don't think they do frowny faces. They just do eating other insects' faces and not eating other insects. So this is an opportunity for us to really get creative with it. I want to shoot this at the end of the day, so I want to warm the image quite a bit. I'm going to use flash today, by the way. If I was using continuous light, I might not do anything other than use the continuous light. But in this case, I'm going to do this with flash. So I'm going to probably use 3 lights. But my first light is going to be my main light. And because of the fact that she has this gun on this side, it won't show up in this frame because this is just her head is framed. But I'll probably take some more pictures and I'll want the gun to be lit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a sun that is setting over here. And that will be my main light. And when I get that positioned, and I'm just going to use 1 speed light for that, I'll put a gel on it and I'll diffuse it. Then depending on what we have left, I imagine there's going to be a lot of heavy shadow on this side. I'm going to use a 2nd speed light at a very low setting just to take the edge off the shadows. I don't want to completely expose this side, but I don't want it to be super dark. Now, I would normally, if this was a hairy thing, I would want to add a 3rd light back over here about from your angle so that I could pick up the hair a little bit. But this is plastic hair. In fact, it's not hair at all. It's just plastic and it won't do anything. It'll make a rim and it'll make it look more like plastic. So instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is come up with a background that makes her pop. Now that shouldn't be too hard to do because she has 2 very complementary colors. They're not actually complementary. They're part of a triad. The light corn golden color and the light blue dress will play perfectly off something between a pinkish and magenta background. Now, I don't have one of that color, but I have something that if I'm careful with my light, I can get by with. I think I can change the color of it with the lighting just enough to make it work together. So first thing we're going to do is I'm going to set up the first light, take a shot and see what we get. I've already put the flash units on bendy arms just to save a little bit of time. And this one is going to be mounted over where you are. To get the subtle sunset, I'm going to use a little bit of warming gel and a layer of packing foam just to fragment the light a little bit so it's not quite so directional. So let me get this set up and I'll be back. All right, so I have the first light, but before I turn it on, I'm going to see how much of this video light I can get away with. Oh, a lot. That's pitch black. So I'm going to leave the video light on so that you can I'm not just a disembodied voice. Okay, let me turn this flash on. Now, I have a feeling it's going to take about 1/8 power, but I'm going to start a little lower. Let's see what 1/16 looks like. Now, what I've done is added a single layer of the orange warming gel, a single layer of the diffuser, quite close in front of the lens, and I've got it set on 1/16 power. Okay, I like the color, but it's not bright enough. Let's take it up a full stop to 1/8. See what that looks like. Okay, I like that. I was concerned that her hair, seeing as it's just a piece of plastic, was going to throw a shadow on her face, but it doesn't. So we've got the light coming in at a good angle, and I like the color of it. It's very subtle. This is the point at which I would very carefully look over everything on my subject to make sure that there wasn't anything that I was missing as far as getting the illumination to. This is the important light. It's why they call it the key light. And I'll spend a lot more time working with this light than I will with the others. Now, as you can see from the photograph, the other side of her face and hair is in almost complete blackness, and that doesn't look good at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a second flash. So I'm going to use another Godox just like this. I'm going to position it on the right side of the cage, maybe a little bit lower down than this, and I'm going to try to just throw enough fill light onto the right side of her face so that it isn't quite so dark. I'm going to use a grid as well to keep the light right where I want it, just on that side of her face. I don't want excess light spreading out and bouncing all over. So let me set up that second flash. The second flash is in place, and as you can see, I've got it dropped a little bit lower down. I've got a fine grid, meaning small hold grid, that will give a lot of direction to the light. And I've put another piece of the warming gel over that so that we have an even color. Now, for some reason, my trigger's not working with this light. So I think I'll start 3 stops lower. So where are we? 1/8, so 16, 32nd, 1/64th. I'll just go whole stops. Let's see what this looks like at 1/64th. That's not 1/64th. That's way too bright. Okay. Well, I have a feeling I'm going to have to do something else. Let me take it down to 1/28th. 1/128th. I like the color and everything, and the direction's good, but it's just way too bright. I wonder why that is. Okay, well, I have 2 things that I can do, and both of them are probably worth trying. One would be to add a little layer of diffusion. That's better, but it's too bright still. So this is where the inverse square law is helpful to us. All I have to do, remember, if I double the distance to her, I'm going to reduce the intensity of the light by a factor of 4, which will probably be too dark, so I won't use the diffuser until I've done a test shot. Let's see what that does. It's still a little bit too light, but it's very close. Okay, that's what I want. So let me put this on. Well, I'm going to need some, can I double duty the sticky tape? Probably. Okay, let's see what that does. All right, I love that. Now we have a very natural looking fall off to the right side of her head, and there's plenty of shadow down the left side, right cutting through her eye. I like that. And I think that that balance is perfect. Now, let's see what will happen when I add a backlight to this. Now for the backlight, I'm just going to use an extra flash I have sitting around. It's not very powerful, but I don't want much light. I just want to brighten up the background. Now, I don't know what color this is, aubergine or puce or something like that. I don't know. I don't really know what it is. Now, I want this back far enough that it's completely out of focus, and I want the light to be cutting across it. I don't really care where it comes from. I could have just put this on a stand on the table. I just don't want anything bouncing back off it. So let me put it up on the back of the cage like this. And this is the least important light. The only thing that could mess this up would be if my choice of color was bad. I'm not even going to diffuse this. There's no reason. I probably will start at 1/128th and just see what happens. Okay, that looks like it's aimed right. All right, let's take a picture. That's the color I was looking for, lilac. But that is bright enough to be darkening her. So I'm going to ever so slightly bump up the flash on the right, and I'm going to move it a little bit more to the front, just a little. I mean, I had this really pretty low, so let's try this. I'm liking it. It's amazing how getting that light increased just a little bit made a huge difference in the color. So before I pack everything in, like I told you before, I check to make sure that everything I want in focus is sharply in focus. So that is one way to light a subject. Of course, every subject is different, and your emphasis is going to change every time you take a new picture. Everything comes down to the positioning of the lights, and this is just a quick and dirty example. There's no strict formula for how you light small subjects. I would argue that there is a strict formula for the steps you go through to do it. Now, if this had been a particularly difficult subject to light, like a lot of insects are, and I was trying to ensure that I had the balance between the antennas and the mouth parts where I wanted it, I may have turned off my first flash to work on the second and then the third. And I'd have done the same thing as I added reflectors or flags. In this case, I didn't do any of that, but you certainly can. The trick is to come up with a sequence of actions and then a way to double check behind yourself to make sure that you're accomplishing what you set out to do. The only way that you can mess this up is to put all three of your lights or four of your lights plus your background all up at the same time, turn them all on, cross your fingers and take a picture. I can pretty much guarantee you that will never work to your satisfaction. Even when you get lucky, you could probably have done it better. So being methodical and orderly and doing it the same way every time will really get you a lot of the way there. And all of this would have been the same. I'd have followed the same steps if I was using continuous light. One thing I didn't mention earlier when we were talking about continuous lighting is if we were to just use 3 lights and as slower shutter speed as we could get away with, we're still going to end up with noise. And if we were stacking this image, we would be stacking noise. And that's why avoiding noise is so important when you're focus stacking. Just like avoiding any other artifact that can build up over time. But one of the reasons I love flash is once you get them set, you're not going to have any noise. Because I'm shooting, by the way, with an ISO of 100. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. My shutter speed was the sync speed of 1/250th. And I was using, I think I had an aperture of f11. All right, demonstration over. Let's move on. So to wrap this one up and to wrap up the entire series, actually, let me just make a couple of quick points. Take time to practice. I still carve out time every week, a block of time during which I practice skills that I may not be using as much as I used to. You're learning a lot of very specific approaches to taking specific photographs using specific techniques, and that's great. But every once in a while, try something different. Every now and again, you'll stumble upon something that could become something of a signature for you. So don't be afraid to try things that fly in the face of everything that I've been talking about. Different kinds of light, for example, transmitted light. We haven't even talked about that, but putting your subject on a surface through which you can illuminate him or her from below. Another thing that I have a lot of interest in is using fiber optic lighting. Now, I've done a lot of playing around with it in the past. I recently got my hands on a couple of bendy arm fiber optic cables, but I'm trying to modify mine so I can use it with a speed light. That's the kind of experimenting I'm talking about. Using gels, using lenses, using other ways to distort the light. There's all kinds of things that you can do. I have one final best practice before I leave, and this doesn't have anything to do with macro photography lighting specifically, but it has a lot to do with everything we do in our lives, and that is find somebody to help with this stuff. Find somebody who's been doing it shorter time than you have, and tell them what you've learned. It's the best thing you can possibly do for your own learning, and it's just a nice thing to do for a person that's struggling to understand this fairly complicated material. Well, we are done with the lighting series, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it. I've learned a lot doing it, and I hope it's been useful for you too. If you have an idea for a video that doesn't involve me endangering my life or eating worms, please leave it in the comments below, because I'm looking for some new ideas. I actually have several weeks of ideas I'm working on now, but it'll be several weeks from now very soon. So give me your ideas if there's something you want to see. Thanks again to my Patreon supporters. Thanks to everybody who watches the channel and likes and comments and rings the bell and subscribes and does all of that. If you're not subscribed, please consider doing so. If you're not a member of our Discord group, please become one. I'll leave a link in the show notes. Thank you again. I really appreciate it. And yay us. We finished the lighting series. See you soon. Goodbye.